Barron Trump was never just the president's son. From a young age, he was surrounded by attention, both in the media and from the people he met. And while Donald Trump was such a big figure that it would seem his son might be eclipsed in the public consciousness, the Barron always stood out for his difference. He was not as flamboyant or charismatic as his father, and he did not try to attract attention with loud statements. He preferred the shadows to the bright lights, absorbed in his hobbies and personal interests. But despite his reticence, the Barron knew that his life would be very different from the lives of ordinary people. And so, at the age of 18, he found himself at the center of one of the most important events of his life. When he decided to sue one of the most prominent judges, Ronald Beckett, he knew that his actions would generate enormous interest and political context. Many people, both pro and anti-Trump, expected Barron to become a public figure like his father. But Barron was prepared to do things his own way. He knew that his intelligence and training would be his greatest allies. The decision to sue a prominent judge who had made provocative comments about politics and the Trump family in the past seemed shocking but reasonable for a young man who was confident that he was right. From the start, Barron found himself in an environment where his every word was being watched. The trial quickly became not only a legal battle, but also a political one. In the courtroom, where he was to face the experienced and respected Ronald Beckett, Barron maintained an unflappable calm. The judge, accustomed to tough and outspoken statements, expected Barron to feel the stress that often comes with young people in such a situation. Instead, Barron seemed so confident that it immediately attracted the attention of everyone present. The trial began with routine statements and formal questions, but the Barron demonstrated from the very first minutes that he had not come to peacefully resolve issues. He stood in the courtroom with pride and readiness to defend his arguments. His voice was even, and his thoughts were clear and logical. The judge's questions did not confuse him, but only made him think even more deeply. Each time the Barron began to answer, more and more people in the courtroom began to realize that before them was not just the son of an influential person, but someone who could present truly well-founded arguments and conduct his own investigation. In the first few hours of the trial, everyone expected the case to proceed as usual. Judge Beckett was usually able to manipulate the situation and use his experience to gain an advantage in the conversation. However, Barron was not one to give up easily. He used his intelligence and his experience to deal with the statements that came from the judge. He did not try to make sharp remarks or attack, he proceeded calmly, relying on facts and logic. Every question the judge asked was not merely rhetorical. It was designed to erode Barron's confidence, to make him lose his cool. But Barron did not lose his cool. He answered questions clearly, confidently, and without hesitation. The judge, noticing this, began to feel a little dissatisfied. He was used to the fact that young people, especially famous ones like Barron Trump, usually act impulsively and are easily led astray. But the Barron, surprisingly, was in control. And not only in control, but gradually began to win the respect of the audience. Day after day, the trial progressed, but Barron confidently moved towards his goal. During the first day of the trial, it became clear that this was not just a personal fight for him. He stood for an idea. He represented not only his personal truth, but also a broader fight for justice. His calm and confidence began to have a strong influence on the people in the room. Barron became not just the president's son, he became the voice of a new generation that was ready to fight for its right to truth and justice. The whole atmosphere of this first day of the trial remained tense. Judge Beckett, who had tried to take an active stance several times already, now began to sense that his plans might not work. Barron Trump might be young, but his intelligence and analytical ability exceeded all expectations. And for the judge, this was a real challenge. As the trial gathered momentum, each step Barron Trump took seemed more confident than the last. Judge Beckett, an experienced and respected judge, was accustomed to difficult cases, but with each new argument the Barron made, it became clearer that this case would be unusual. The courtroom felt the tension. The Barron was not an ordinary teenager with only secular interests. He had shown everyone that his mind was not limited to his father's political legacy, and that his ability to analyze and think logically sometimes exceeded even the highest expectations. When the trial began, many expected Barron to follow a formulaic strategy, trying to use big words or old political tricks. But he was completely different. When answering questions, he did not focus on big words, but increasingly focused on the facts. Every word he said was carefully thought out, every movement was controlled. Judge Beckett was not happy with this calm and was already beginning to feel that he could not conduct this trial in his usual manner. To his questions, with which he was accustomed to making witnesses uncomfortable, Barron answered clearly and calmly, giving the judge no reason to manipulate. As the case began, Barron's presence in the room became noticeable. He spoke not only for himself, but for all those who felt that the system too often protected those who manipulated society. From the start, Barron insisted that his lawsuit was not a political act, but an attempt to restore honesty to the legal system. He argued that the recent behavior of some officials and people in high society was undermining trust in institutions, and that judges like Beckett should not simply act on personal convictions but also fully comply with the law, giving no reason to doubt their impartiality. The Baron knew he had two strongest cards: his ability to listen and his impeccable preparation. He not only read the laws and their interpretations, but also frequently referred to the precedents on which many of his assertions were based. The judge, who had initially tried to seize the initiative, felt himself losing it with each passing hour. The Baron, silently and discreetly, turned every weak point into an argument against the process itself, forcing Beckett to retreat. When the judge tried to use a tactic he had used on other litigants, a tricky question to tear the defendant apart, Barron used a lull in the conversation. He did it with such confidence that everyone in the room saw the tension and frustration begin to spread throughout the room. It was a moment when even the lawyers in the room sensed that Barron was not only standing up to the judge, but was effortlessly beating him. "Your question is meaningless," said the Baron, pointing to the judge's statement, which he believed was not in accordance with the law. "You want to put me under a moral obligation, but in fact you are breaking the rules." The judge tried to wave it off, but there was hesitation in his eyes. Beckett knew that at this point his actions were not only ineffective, but also questionable. The courtroom fell silent, and everyone present realized that the clash between the two sides had become more serious than expected. The audience in the hall watched the Baron's every move. This was a turning point. He was not just Donald Trump's son, he was an independent figure who did not allow his personality to be ignored. The questions he answered were not only political but also moral. The levitation of laws and justice in the eyes of the public became obvious. The Baron himself seemed unfazed by the pressure. He knew his case was strong and logical. His answers were so precise and well-reasoned that Judge Beckett could only tacitly admit his own inadequacy in this case. Every step the Baron took was a step toward victory, and the judge knew it. But the most important thing was not how the Baron dealt with this or that issue. What was important was that he was able to prove that his intellect and determination could stand up to even the most highly professional system, which often looked for weaknesses in others. Those who once considered him simply the heir to his name now saw in him a man capable of fighting for justice and insisting on his right to be heard. Baron Trump continued to pick apart every word of his opponent, Judge Ronald Beckett, with such confidence that the entire room felt as if they were dealing not with an 18-year-old, but with a seasoned lawyer with dozens of cases to his credit. His calm and determination surprised everyone, including Beckett, who was accustomed to decisive and often aggressive countermeasures from his opponents. Instead of becoming confused or aggressive, the Baron remained calm and collected, giving the impression that he was in control of not only the situation, but the moment. When the judge finally asked the question that the Baron had initially ignored, everyone in the courtroom began to sense that something was wrong. Beckett was experienced enough to ask a question that would normally have thrown off anyone else in the trial. The Baron, however, wasted no time worrying. He raised his head confidently, studied the papers in front of him, and answered slowly, "I would ask you to clarify on what basis you decided that my actions were contrary to the laws. In fact, this process should be based solely on facts, and not on political beliefs." The room held its breath. Even the most experienced lawyers were not always so sure of their words. For a moment, even Beckett froze, because he realized that it would not be so easy to manipulate this young man. The Baron continued calmly. We are not talking about someone winning or losing the election. We are talking about the right to justice, about the right of everyone to be heard. This is the basis of our legislation. His words sounded as if he was teaching these principles laid down in the Constitution of the country. The judge, trying to prevent him from developing this thought, gave another blow, but the Baron parried him again, effectively removing all possible doubts. Every move the Baron made in this process was calculated. He understood that any emotional involvement in the argument could work against him, so he always remained calm and reasonable. In response to questions that many thought he could respond to reactively, the Baron remained within the framework of strict logic, relying on facts and details that were in his favor. He was not in a hurry, did not give in to emotions, and this was his main advantage. Beckett tried again and again to engage him in debate, trying to catch him out, but the Baron, in turn, used the pauses skillfully to build his arguments. The judge expected the young men to speak quickly and loudly, perhaps overdoing it in their attempts to justify their actions. But the Baron held his own, not disturbing the general picture of calm, and each of his answers sounded calm, confident, and precise. By this time, even the courtroom had begun to listen. Some members of the panel had begun to write down his answers in their notebooks, and what had seemed like a routine process now took on new meaning. The Baron had not only presented his arguments, he had taught everyone in the courtroom how to act in court with absolute confidence, insisting on truth and justice. He had demonstrated how to go beyond mere opposition and begin to understand the essence of the problem. Barron had truly captivated the audience, and it showed. Even those who had come to support the judge began to question his logic. Caroline Levitt, who was watching the proceedings from the audience, could not hide her admiration. She, like no one else, understood that this level of preparation and this approach to solving legal issues could change everything. Finally, the judge, realizing that he could not so easily keep the wheel of the conflict in his hands, tried to change tactics again. He began to talk about the Baron's personal qualities, trying to get him out of his state of cold calculation. "Aren't you afraid that your position won't be accepted by society?" he asked with a hint of sarcasm. The Baron, without ceasing to look the judge in the eye, answered with a smile that only emphasized his confidence. "I am not afraid of being heard. I am not afraid that my ideas will be received with amazement. I am afraid of only one thing, that this country will lose its justice, and people will stop fighting for their rights." Those words were a turning point. Beckett realized he was no longer just a judge, but a participant in what was becoming the most important trial in the country. The courtroom was silent, watching as a young man, the son of a famous businessman, became, perhaps, an important voice for a new generation that was ready to fight for justice. The trial was reaching its climax, and Barron Trump was no longer just a participant in the proceedings. He had become a figurehead. Each new day in the courtroom was not just a new step in the legal struggle, but also a spectacle. His self-confidence, calm, and uncanny ability to stand up to a powerful opponent created an atmosphere in which it seemed that only he could dictate the terms. Judge Beckett, despite his experience, increasingly realized that the situation was spinning out of his control. Beckett was a man accustomed to tough confrontations, and he did not think that the young man, despite his political surname, was capable of putting him under such pressure. Every time the judge tried to ask a tricky question, the Baron answered in such a way that his counterarguments left no room for manipulation. The judge realized that his standard tactic of trying to confuse his opponent no longer worked. Instead of catching the Baron out on an emotional reaction or contradictions in words, he was forced to deal with logic and reasoning that could not be refuted. The Baron continued to act methodically. His answers were devoid of pathos, but filled with precision and restraint. In this process, he demonstrated not only his knowledge of the law, but also a rare skill for his age to analyze and solve problems. He increasingly began to understand that his speeches were no longer limited to judicial practice, but were reaching higher levels. His behavior, his speeches, His calm under stress became an example for many in the courtroom, and even for the judge. But the tension was mounting, and it was no longer a secret to anyone that this trial could change a lot. The judicial panel, which had previously followed the proceedings with restraint, began to show interest in what was happening. Every word of Barron was now perceived not as a simple statement by a man defending himself, but as an important part of the process that eclipsed all previous court cases related to politics. One of the key moments was a remark by Barron that completely changed the course of the entire trial. When Beckett tried again to reduce the proceedings to questions of personal sympathies or political commitment, Barron responded softly and calmly. "I don't claim to be an expert. I'm just a person who believes in law and justice, and perhaps, unlike some, I'm not prepared to use politics for personal gain." These words were not just a response to the judge's attempt to discredit him, but a statement that upended the perception of him in the courtroom. The judge, who had expected Barron to continue to defend himself as an heir and a political figure, realized that he was dealing with a man who refused to accept the role of his father's shadow. He was not just Trump's son, he was a person in his own right, ready to fight for his own truth. However, as expected, the conflict was not without emotional excesses on both sides. At one point, the judge succumbed to the temptation to resort to personal attacks, which he thought might confuse the Barron. But instead of responding to the attack with aggression, the Barron simply raised an eyebrow and said, "I don't think it matters. We are here to discuss the law, not to make personal attacks." This was the turning point. The room went silent. Everyone realized that the Barron had not only won this small battle, but had begun to gain authority in a trial that had seemed so simple to him. Beckett, realizing that the situation had gotten out of hand, tried to steer the conversation back to a more normal course, but it was too late. His feeble attempts to regain the initiative seemed clearly out of place against the backdrop of how confidently the Barron continued his line. At this stage of the trial, it was no longer a question of who was right and who was wrong. Barron Trump had simply shown that he was, in fact, more than just Trump's son. The trial was winding down, and the tension in the courtroom was at its peak. Barron Trump, either holding back his emotions nor losing his composure, was gaining more and more control with each new word. His eyes were determined, his voice did not waver, and it seemed that none of the confrontations with the court or his opponents could shake him. Even the seasoned Judge Ronald Beckett, who was not used to giving in, realized that he would most likely not win this trial. Barron continued to advance his arguments, but at some point he changed his strategy. He stopped focusing solely on analyzing the mistakes of his opponents, and began to address the court, and those present with more personal reflections. He spoke about the importance of truth, about the meaning of justice in the legal system. His speech became more and more philosophical, and his words were more than just a defense in court. He said that the judge and the entire judicial system should not become an instrument for political play, but should be a support for those who seek justice. With each phrase, Barron continued to demonstrate that he had a much deeper understanding of what the law is and how it should work than his opponent. Judge Beckett tried to maintain a veneer of confidence, but Barron Trump soon stripped him of it. As he raised his arguments, backed by law, precedent, and example, the judge began to feel his own position fading. It was important not just to defend himself well, but to present his ideas in a way that would outshine all others. But what was even more surprising to those in the room was that Barron did more than just answer questions and present evidence. He also continually reminded the judge and everyone around him that it was important to maintain humanity and integrity, even when circumstances demand unpopular decisions. Barron's words did not sound like mere excuses. They were filled with meaning that everyone in the room could feel. He spoke of how the people behind the court should be an example for everyone who seeks justice. Meanwhile, the courtroom was beginning to fall silent. The spectators, who had not seemed prepared for this turn of events, were becoming increasingly attentive to Barron's every move. He was winning respect not only for his preparation, but also for his ability to think broadly, to see the trial as something more than just a legal process. Judge Beckett began to realize that he was no longer in control of the proceedings. At one point, It even seemed to him that the Baron, this young man, was actually running the trial, and that he, the old and experienced judge, was simply forced to react to his every move. His questions became increasingly confused and nervous, while the Baron continued to calmly and confidently destroy each of these attacks. As the judge attempted to close the case and wrap things up, Baron Trump spoke again, more forcefully and firmly than ever. He reminded everyone that a real court should serve the people, not political interests. He emphasized that the truth always matters, and that no one, including him or the judge, should put personal gain ahead of justice. The Baron added that this case, for all its publicity, was just part of a much larger movement for integrity in the court and in the country. The Baron ended his speech in such a way that everyone in the room understood that this was not just a legal case, but the beginning of a new era in judicial practice. This process became an example of how one can win not only a case, but also respect and trust of society. For Baron Trump, this moment became an important stage in his life. He proved to himself and everyone around him that he can be not just Trump's son, but also an independent person, capable of making his own decisions and fighting for his truth. When the judge finally announced his decision, the silence in the courtroom was deathly quiet. Everyone understood that this was not just a victory for the Baron, but a moment that could change everything. The judge, despite his experience, realized that Baron Trump had forced him and everyone in the room to think about truth, justice, and the future of the judicial system.